Hello, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Alex,
My name is Vinay.
and in today's talk, we'll be discussing our work investigating growth in online communities. To begin, I'd like for you to imagine for a moment that you're interested in starting your own online community. For instance, let's say you're deeply interested in machine learning. All spaces you find online are focused on uses of AI tools. However, you'd like to create a space for individuals to have more formal academic discussions around fundamental machine learning topics. Early on, your community is at around 32,000 members. But suddenly, shortly after the release of ChatGPT, your community has ballooned to almost 3 million members. While you're excited about people's interest in your community, you notice a recent post from a disappointed community member who observes that the quality of the content being shared and that of the discussions being had has gone down within your community. As another moderator on your team notes, with the influx of new members, it's become much more difficult and tiresome to keep up with the influx of new contributions, making it harder for you to prevent your community from drifting closer to being another space for discussing general AI tools. This example is illustrative of a perceived trade-off that's been noted by community moderators in prior qualitative work. On one hand, moderators want to create an active, thriving community. On the other hand, moderators want their communities to be unique, offering something different from what's currently available in other online communities.
So even though in interview, moderators mention this perceived trade-off between growing a community and crafting a distinctive online space, it's not clear the extent to which this really happens. The main goal of our study is to examine the extent to which this growth distinctiveness trade-off is present in online communities. Additionally, we're interested in identifying factors that might make this trade-off stronger or weaker. For one, we hypothesize that strictly moderated communities may be able to accommodate more growth while seeing smaller changes to their distinctiveness. Additionally, we hypothesize that the growth distinctiveness trade-off might be sharper during periods where a community is attracting a more diverse audience. We're going to walk you guys through the design for a study to test these hypotheses. First, we're going to talk about how we translated concepts like distinctiveness and diversification into concrete study measures. Second, we'll talk about how we sampled Reddit data to extract these measures from. And finally, we'll discuss the statistical models we use to test our hypotheses. So let's start by talking about the study measures. There's 4 variables we need to measure to answer our research questions, and we decided to measure all 4 of these concepts in the context of a community's commenting behavior. 2 of our measures were pretty straightforward. We measured community growth by looking at changes to a community's subscriber count, and we measured the strictness of a community's moderation by looking at their comment removal rate. Unfortunately, measuring distinctiveness and diversification are much less straightforward, so we'll walk through these measures a bit more carefully. Let's start with distinctiveness. We argue that a distinctive subreddit is one whose comments are easy to differentiate from a random sample of Reddit comments. This sounds pretty good, but how do we actually quantify this? The backbone of our approach is what's called a text embedding model. If you're not familiar, text embedding models are neural networks that convert text into vector representations. We chose to use SBERT, which is a pretty popular text embedder. Notably, SBERT has the property that similar sentences get mapped to similar vectors. Although SBERT gives us a means to compare pairs of comments, we're really interested in making comparisons between subreddits. To address this, we adopted a custom fine-tuning procedure that transforms SBERT from a comment embedding model into a subreddit embedding model. We'll leave the details of this procedure out of the talk, but they are included in the paper. Once we have a means of making comparisons between subreddits, we're finally ready to measure community distinctiveness. We say that a subreddit's distinctiveness is the cosine distance between its embedding at a specific point in time and the embedding for a hypothetical subreddit comprised of a random sample of comments from across Reddit. You can think of this random sample as representing typical or average Reddit discourse. Intuitively, the more distinct a subreddit is from a random sample of Reddit comments, the farther apart these two subreddit embeddings will be. So that's the distinctiveness measure in a nutshell. At a high level, we're applying an embedding model to comments in a subreddit and comparing the outputs to a random sample of Reddit comments. Let's now talk about how we measure diversity. We adopt the definition that a diverse subreddit is one that brings together users who generally don't participate in the same communities. To build intuition about how we'd estimate this, let's start with a hypothetical example. Imagine we had the Reddit browsing histories for the authors of this paper. Just looking at this data, which pair of users do you think would be the most likely to participate in a shared community sometime in the future? You could probably guess it's Alex and Vinay. Why? Well, for one thing, they already participate in one community together, r/URUC. But you can also see they participate in other communities whose user bases are really overlapping. So for example, Vinay participates in r/Bay Area, while Alex participates in r/Warriors, which is the Bay Area basketball team. Based on this intuition, we adapt a user embedding approach from prior work. Users get similar vector representations when they participate in the same communities or communities with overlapping user bases. And once we have a set of user embeddings, we can calculate a subreddit's diversity score. To do this, we take the average cosine distance between the embedding for each user in a subreddit and the centroid of all embeddings for users from that subreddit. So intuitively, if all the users in a subreddit are really similar, the embeddings will be tightly clustered around the centroid, and therefore the diversity score will be pretty low. Those are our study measures. Now we're going to talk about how we constructed a data set to answer our research questions.
To start, because we're interested in studying growing online communities, we first need a way to identify subreddits that have actually experienced substantial growth. To do so, we look at all the communities that were created between the beginning of March 2018 and the end of December 2019, and pull out only those communities that reached at least 10,000 subscribers at some point in their first 2 years of existence. For each newly created subreddit in our sample, we track the growth and activity of the community for 2 years from its inception. Now, having a sample of subreddits, for each subreddit in each month, we collect several pieces of data. First, all comments made in the subreddit, then the number of subscribers at the end of each month, and a random sample of comments from across Reddit. After filtering out suspected bot accounts and checking for the latest removal status of comments, we end up with a sample of 1,620 subreddits representing about 12 million unique authors and about 318 million comments. So that's an overview of the dataset we constructed. Before we get into any formal statistical modeling, let's first see what our dataset looks like after applying our study measures. To validate our subreddit selection strategy, we plot the distributions of subscribers in the first and last months of each subreddit in our sample. You can see a clear shift in the distribution, indicating that we successfully identified growing subreddits.
We can also qualitatively validate our distinctiveness measure. Here are the top 5 most distinctive subreddits in our dataset. In general, these subreddits were highly goal-oriented and usually oriented around sharing advice or knowledge on a technical topic. For example, here's a comment from r/whitecoatinvestor, a subreddit dedicated to sharing investment advice for doctors. You can see that the comment is really focused and not likely to appear in a lot of other places on Reddit.
To gain an early insight into the relationship between distinctiveness, diversity, and community size, we plot the relationships between our measures in the last month of each subreddit's 2-year growth window against community size. From this, we observe that larger subreddits tend to be associated with lower distinctiveness and higher user-base diversity. In comparing how the distinctiveness and diversity of subreddits in our sample has changed between their earliest month and their latest month, we observe a decrease in distinctiveness and an increase in diversity between the first and last months of each subreddit's 2-year period.
Okay, So hopefully at this point, you feel like you have some sense of what the study measures look like when we actually apply them to our data set. And you might be getting some early hints as to the answers to our research questions. We saw that bigger subreddits tended to be less distinctive, and also subreddits shifted to be less distinctive over the course of the 2-year observation window. But to get precise answers to our research questions, we need to use a more formal statistical model. We'll talk about a simplified version of what the model looks like here, though you can refer to the paper for more precise, detailed walkthrough. To understand our model, let's first think about what the data we're modeling actually looks like. For each community we sampled, we have a time series of distinctiveness data points like so. And if we look at 2 adjacent time points, we can observe month-to-month changes in a subreddit's distinctiveness. Very simply, we model the changes in distinctiveness as a linear function of the growth a subreddit experiences during that month-to-month window. This allows us to answer our first research question about the strength of the relationship between growth and changes in distinctiveness. Further, we treat this slope itself as a function of a community's removal rate and diversification experienced. This allows us to answer our second and third research questions about sort of other factors that influence the strength of the association between growth and distinctiveness change. Finally, to aggregate information across subreddits, we adopt a Bayesian hierarchical modeling strategy. Once we fit the model's data, we can reason about our results by plotting what our model thinks will happen in a number of hypothetical scenarios. So first, let's imagine we have a community that doesn't moderate its comments at all and doesn't undergo any diversification. We can plot what the model thinks will happen when we vary different amounts of growth factors the subreddit experiences. So you can see that the more growth the subreddit experiences, the larger a drop in distinctiveness the model predicts. For example, when a subreddit 2x's in size, the model predicts an average drop in distinctiveness of about 0.01. And when a subreddit 10x's in size, the model predicts a drop of about 0.05. Although these numbers may seem small, it's worth noting that these correspond to predicted changes within a single month. So these results are definitely still consistent with larger changes over a subreddit's entire lifespan. Okay, so what happens if we vary the amount of diversification a subreddit experiences? It turns out the predicted growth curves look really similar. And the same thing is true when you vary a subreddit's removal rate. So in short, we do see signs of an apparent trade-off between growth and distinctiveness. As subreddits grew, it seems like they tended to become less distinctive. However, it doesn't seem like moderation or diversification, as we measured them, do much to change the strength of this association.
At this point, you may be wondering if this trade-off always exists. In other words, are growing communities destined to look more and more like a typical community? On the one hand, our sample contained some subreddits that closely follow this model trend. On the other hand, there are clear exceptions to this trend, with some subreddits in our sample even gaining distinctiveness. Even though our work surfaces an aggregate trend, we don't yet fully understand the factors that explain why we see so much variation. Explaining this variation would enable moderators to reason about the degree to which our results apply to them. Going back to our opening example, as the moderator of your own growing community, ideally, you want to know what will happen to your own community, not the average community. For community moderators to gain a better understanding of their own community's relationship with growth and how they might manage it, it's important for future work to continue to tease apart the causal relationship between growth and distinctiveness. In doing so, moderators can be better equipped to balance the desire for cultivating a growing, active community with that of fostering a unique, distinctive space.
Okay. So we'd like to close by thanking the Center for Just Infrastructures for funding this work, the Social Spaces Research Group for feedback on early versions of this work, and Jason Baumgartner and the PushShift team for providing the data set. And all data and code that we use in this project is available on GitHub.